The crystal chandelier above the Grand Sterling restaurant cast dancing shadows across the white marble floors as dozens of well-dressed patrons enjoyed their expensive meals. Located in the heart of Manhattan, the restaurant was known for serving only the wealthiest clients who could afford its $1,000 entrees and exclusive atmosphere. On this particular Tuesday evening, a small commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. A woman in an elegant silk kimono walked through the heavy oak doors, her presence immediately commanding the room's focus. She appeared to be in her 60s, with silver hair styled in a traditional Japanese manner and jewelry that sparkled under the lights. Her face carried an expression of calm dignity, though her eyes seemed distant and troubled. Two younger women accompanied her, speaking rapidly in Japanese while trying to guide her toward a reserved table near the window. Marcus Wellington, the restaurant's general manager, rushed forward with his usual practiced smile. He had worked at the Grand Sterling for 15 years and prided himself on recognizing important guests. The reservation book had listed her as Yuki Tanaka, and the brief note mentioned she was a prominent businesswoman from Tokyo. What the note failed to mention was that she would arrive in such an unusual state. The woman stood frozen near the entrance, her fingers clutching a small beaded purse. Her companions continued speaking to her in urgent whispers, but she remained motionless, staring at something only she could see. Other diners began to notice the scene, their conversations dropping to hushed murmurs as they observed the strange tableau. Marcus approached with his professional courtesy and tact, bowing slightly as he addressed the group. He spoke slowly and clearly, welcoming them to the restaurant and offering to show them to their table. The two younger women, who introduced themselves as assistants to Mrs. Tanaka, exchanged worried glances. They explained in broken English that their employer had been experiencing difficulties since arriving in New York 3 days ago. She had stopped speaking entirely and seemed unable to respond to questions or follow simple instructions. The situation grew more uncomfortable as Marcus attempted to communicate directly with Mrs. Tanaka. He used hand gestures and simple words, trying various approaches to connect with the silent woman. Nothing worked. She remained standing in place, her expression unchanged, seemingly trapped in some invisible prison of her own mind. The other guests were now openly staring, some with curiosity, and others with clear annoyance at the disruption to their evening. Sarah Mitchell had been working as a waitress at the Grand Sterling for only 8 months. At 26 years old, she was one of the few black staff members in the predominantly white establishment, and she had fought hard to earn her position, despite facing skepticism from some of the older employees. She carried plates with practiced grace and maintained a warm smile even during the longest shifts, though her real passion lay in the psychology books she studied during her breaks. Sarah was saving money to return to graduate school, determined to become a therapist who could help people navigate their darkest moments. From her position near the kitchen doors, Sarah watched the scene unfold with growing concern. She recognized the signs immediately, though she kept her observations to herself. The woman's vacant stare, the rigid posture, the complete withdrawal from her surroundings all pointed to something specific. Sarah had studied similar cases in her undergraduate psychology courses and had even volunteered at a crisis center where she encountered people in various states of mental distress. Marcus was becoming increasingly flustered as his attempts at communication continued to fail. The assistants looked desperate, explaining that Mrs. Tanaka had important business meetings scheduled for the rest of the week, and they had hoped a nice dinner might help her relax and recover. They mentioned that she had been under tremendous stress recently, dealing with the sudden death of her husband 6 months ago and taking over his vast business empire. The pressure had apparently become too much during this trip to New York. One of the wealthy diners, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, called out loudly that the restaurant should move the situation elsewhere as it was disturbing everyone's meals. Others nodded in agreement, their patience wearing thin. Marcus apologized profusely to the complaining guests while trying to maintain his composure. He suggested to the assistants that perhaps they should take Mrs. Tanaka back to her hotel, but the women insisted they had tried everything and didn't know what else to do. Sarah felt her heart tighten as she observed the scene. She recognized the fear and confusion in the assistants' faces, the growing hostility from the other diners, and most importantly, the deep suffering hidden behind Mrs. Tanaka's blank expression. Every instinct told Sarah to help, but she hesitated. She was just a waitress, and this was a billionaire surrounded by her own staff. What could she possibly offer that they hadn't already tried? The restaurant's owner, Mr. Pemberton, emerged from his office after hearing about the commotion. He was a stern man who valued order and reputation above all else. Sarah watched as he spoke in low, firm tones to Marcus, clearly instructing him to resolve the situation quickly. The message was obvious even from a distance. Get these people out of the restaurant before they drive away other customers. Mrs. Tanaka's assistants began to panic as Marcus gently but firmly suggested they leave. They protested that their employer needed to eat, that she hadn't had a proper meal in 2 days, and that they were hoping the change of environment might break through whatever barrier had formed around her mind. Their pleas fell on deaf ears as Mr. Pemberton himself stepped forward, his expression cold and businesslike as he explained that the restaurant couldn't accommodate guests who disrupted the dining experience of others. Sarah made a decision in that moment that would change everything. She set down her tray, smoothed her uniform, and walked directly toward the group near the entrance. Several of her co-workers watched with wide eyes, knowing that approaching a situation that management was handling could result in serious consequences. Sarah had always been told to stay in her lane, to serve food and nothing more, but something stronger than job security drove her forward. As she drew closer, Sarah could see the fine details of Mrs. Tanaka's face. Beneath the makeup and expensive jewelry was a woman drowning in invisible waters, fighting a battle that no one around her could see or understand. Sarah had witnessed this kind of suffering before, and she knew that sometimes the smallest gesture could create the opening that someone needed to find their way back. Marcus noticed Sarah approaching and held up a hand to stop her, but she continued with quiet determination. The assistants looked at her with a mixture of confusion and hope, perhaps sensing that this young black waitress saw something they had missed. Mr. Pemberton frowned deeply, about to order Sarah back to work when she did something unexpected. Sarah stopped directly in front of Mrs. Tanaka, close enough that they stood face to face. She didn't bow or speak loudly or make any grand gesture. Instead, she simply stood there with gentle eyes, waiting patiently as if she had all the time in the world. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, watching this strange confrontation between a billionaire frozen in silence and a waitress who had no logical reason to be involved. Then Sarah leaned forward slightly, bringing her face closer to Mrs. Tanaka's ear, and whispered a single word so softly that no one else could hear it. The word hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible distance. For several seconds, nothing happened. The restaurant remained suspended in that awkward moment, with all eyes fixed on the two women standing near the entrance. Mr. Pemberton opened his mouth to reprimand Sarah for her interference, and Marcus stepped forward to pull her away from the situation. But before anyone could move, something extraordinary occurred. Mrs. Tanaka's eyes flickered with recognition. It was subtle at first, like a candle flame struggling against the wind, but unmistakable to anyone watching closely. Her rigid shoulders relaxed by the smallest degree, and her fingers loosened their death grip on the beaded purse. A single tear rolled down her cheek, cutting through her carefully applied makeup and leaving a glistening trail in its wake. Sarah maintained her position, not retreating or pushing forward, simply being present with an expression of complete understanding. She whispered the word again, slightly louder this time, and Mrs. Tanaka's lips began to tremble. The older woman's breath caught in her throat, and then suddenly, as if a dam had broken inside her, she released a sound that was part sob and part exhale of relief. The assistants gasped in shock as their employer began to cry openly, tears streaming down her face while her whole body shook with the force of emotions too long suppressed. Sarah gently reached out and took Mrs. Tanaka's hand, squeezing it softly while maintaining eye contact. She spoke in a low, soothing voice, though most people in the restaurant couldn't make out her exact words. Whatever she said seemed to anchor Mrs. Tanaka to the present moment, guiding her back from wherever her mind had been trapped. Marcus stood frozen in confusion, unsure whether to intervene or let this unexpected scene play out. The other diners watched with expressions ranging from fascination to discomfort, unused to witnessing such raw emotion in their refined dining establishment. Mr. Pemberton's angry expression slowly transformed into something approaching curiosity as he observed the interaction between his waitress and the billionaire. Mrs. Tanaka suddenly collapsed against Sarah, who caught her with surprising strength despite the older woman's weight. The two assistants rushed forward to help, but Sarah shook her head gently, indicating they should give their employer space. She guided Mrs. Tanaka to a nearby chair that Marcus quickly provided, kneeling beside her while continuing to hold her hand and speak in that same calm, reassuring tone. The crying continued for several minutes while Sarah remained patient and steady beside the grieving woman. She pulled a clean cloth napkin from a passing server's tray and offered it to Mrs. Tanaka, who accepted it with shaking hands. Slowly, gradually, the intensity of the emotions began to subside, leaving Mrs. Tanaka exhausted but noticeably more present than she had been moments before. When Mrs. Tanaka finally looked up at Sarah, her eyes were red and swollen but clear in a way they hadn't been earlier. She spoke for the first time since entering the restaurant, her voice hoarse and thick with accent but perfectly understandable. She asked Sarah how she knew, how a stranger in a foreign country could possibly understand what she had been experiencing. When her own staff and business associates had been completely lost, Sarah smiled gently and explained that she had recognized the signs of someone drowning in grief so profound that it had paralyzed every other function. The single word she had whispered was simple but powerful: breathe. In her studies, Sarah had learned that people experiencing severe dissociation or emotional shutdown often forgot to perform even the most basic functions. By reminding Mrs. Tanaka to breathe, Sarah had given her mind something concrete to focus on, a tiny lifeline back to her body and the present moment. But there was more to it than just the word itself. Sarah revealed that she had recently lost her own mother to cancer, and during those final weeks, she had watched her mother retreat into a similar silence. The hospice counselor had taught Sarah techniques for reaching people who had withdrawn so far into their pain that they couldn't respond to normal communication. She had whispered "breathe" to her mother countless times, and sometimes it was enough to bring her back for a few precious moments of connection. Mrs. Tanaka listened to Sarah's explanation with growing amazement. She admitted that she had been feeling like she was drowning ever since her husband's death, suffocating under the weight of responsibilities she never wanted and grief she couldn't express. In Japanese culture, she explained, there was tremendous pressure to maintain composure and strength, especially as a woman taking over her late husband's business empire. Everyone expected her to be a pillar of stability, to make difficult decisions without showing weakness, to honor her husband's memory by being perfect. The pressure had built up like water behind a dam, with no outlet for the churning emotions inside her. During the flight to New York, something had finally broken. She had felt herself slipping away into a dark, silent place where nothing could hurt her anymore, but where she also couldn't feel anything at all. Her assistants had been terrified. Doctors had been consulted, but no one could reach her because no one understood that she wasn't sick in body, but drowning in unexpressed sorrow. Sarah nodded with deep understanding as Mrs. Tanaka spoke. She acknowledged that American culture also put pressure on people to get over grief quickly and return to normal functioning, as if losing someone you loved was just a temporary inconvenience. She shared how her co-workers at the restaurant had given her only 3 days off after her mother's death, before expecting her to return to work with a smile on her face. The pain was supposed to be private, hidden, dealt with on your own time without bothering others. The two women sat together in that expensive restaurant, sharing a moment of connection that transcended culture, language, and social class. Around them, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The diners who had been annoyed earlier now watched with something approaching respect, recognizing that they were witnessing something profound. Marcus wiped at his eyes discreetly, moved by the unexpected turn of events, while Mr. Pemberton stood silently with an unreadable expression on his face. Mrs. Tanaka's assistants explained to Sarah that their employer had been scheduled to sign a major business deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars in 2 days. The entire trip to New York revolved around this crucial meeting, and Mrs. Tanaka's sudden breakdown had thrown everything into chaos. They had tried everything they could think of, from calling doctors to contacting her family in Japan, but nothing had helped until Sarah's simple intervention. Sarah suggested gently that perhaps the business deal wasn't the most important thing at that moment. She pointed out that Mrs. Tanaka needed time to grieve properly, to acknowledge her pain rather than pushing through it in the name of duty and responsibility. The human heart wasn't designed to carry such burdens without breaking under the strain. and trying to pretend otherwise only made the damage worse in the long run. Mrs. Tanaka considered Sarah's words carefully, then asked a question that surprised everyone present. She wanted to know if Sarah would be willing to accompany her during her remaining time in New York, not as an employee, but as a companion who understood the landscape of grief. The assistants could handle business matters, but Mrs. Tanaka needed someone who could help her navigate the emotional territory she found herself in. Someone who wouldn't judge her for being weak or tell her to be strong when she felt like crumbling. The request hung in the air like an impossible proposition. Sarah was a waitress with rent to pay and bills to manage, while Mrs. Tanaka was a billionaire who could afford any therapist or counselor in the world. Yet there was something about their connection, forged in that moment of crisis, that made the offer feel right despite its strangeness. Sarah looked at Mr. Pemberton, knowing that accepting would mean leaving her job, possibly permanently. Mr. Pemberton surprised everyone by stepping forward and speaking directly to Sarah for the first time that evening. He admitted that he had been wrong to try to remove Mrs. Tanaka from the restaurant, that he had prioritized business over basic human compassion. What Sarah had done demonstrated a level of emotional intelligence and courage that couldn't be taught, and he would be foolish to stand in the way of such an opportunity. He told Sarah that her position would be waiting for her if she wanted it when she returned, and if not, he would provide an excellent reference for whatever path she chose next. Sarah felt tears prickling at her own eyes as she looked between Mr. Pemberton and Mrs. Tanaka. The decision should have been difficult, but somehow it felt obvious. She had been saving money for graduate school to help people navigate difficult moments, and here was an opportunity to do exactly that in a way she never could have imagined. She accepted Mrs. Tanaka's offer with gratitude and a slight sense of disbelief at how quickly her life had just changed direction. The next morning, Sarah found herself standing in the lobby of the Plaza Hotel, feeling completely out of place in her simple department store dress, while surrounded by marble columns and staff in immaculate uniforms. Mrs. Tanaka had arranged for a car to pick Sarah up from her small apartment in Brooklyn at 8 o'clock sharp, and the driver had been so polite and professional that Sarah had felt nervous the entire ride into Manhattan. One of Mrs. Tanaka's assistants, a young woman named Keiko, met Sarah in the lobby and escorted her to the penthouse suite. The elevator ride seemed to last forever, with Keiko explaining in careful English that Mrs. Tanaka had slept through the night for the first time since arriving in America. The simple act of releasing her emotions in the restaurant had broken through the wall of numbness that had imprisoned her for days. The penthouse was larger than Sarah's entire apartment building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of Central Park. Mrs. Tanaka sat in a comfortable chair near the windows, dressed in a simple gray dress rather than the elaborate kimono from the previous evening. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable without all the trappings of wealth and status surrounding her. When she saw Sarah enter, her face brightened with genuine warmth. They spent the first hour simply talking, with Mrs. Tanaka sharing stories about her late husband and the 42 years they had spent together. She described how they had met as university students in Tokyo, both ambitious and full of dreams about changing the world through business innovation. He had built an empire in technology manufacturing, and she had been his partner in every sense, contributing ideas and strategy, even though she remained largely invisible to the public eye. When he died suddenly from a heart attack, Mrs. Tanaka found herself thrust into a position she never wanted. The board of directors insisted she take over as CEO to maintain stability and honor her husband's legacy. She agreed because that's what everyone expected, but inside she felt like she was dying alongside him. Every business decision, every meeting, every speech to shareholders felt like betraying her grief, pretending to be whole when she was shattered into a million pieces. Sarah listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions but mostly just being present with her full attention. She shared her own experience of watching her mother fade away over 6 painful months, the helplessness of being unable to stop death's approach, and the strange emptiness that followed when the long-expected end finally arrived. She talked about how people at work had treated her grief like an inconvenience, offering generic condolences before quickly changing the subject to something more comfortable. Mrs. Tanaka reached across and squeezed Sarah's hand, recognizing a kindred spirit in someone from a completely different world. She admitted that wealth and power meant nothing when facing the raw reality of loss, that no amount of money could fill the hole left by someone you loved. In some ways, her position made it worse because everyone expected her to be strong enough to handle anything. As if successful people didn't feel pain as deeply as everyone else. They decided to skip the scheduled business meetings for that day, much to the distress of Mrs. Tanaka's assistants and business advisors. Instead, Sarah suggested they take a walk in Central Park. Something simple and human rather than sitting in conference rooms discussing contracts and strategies. Mrs. Tanaka hadn't done anything purely for herself in months, and the idea felt both terrifying and appealing. The two women walked slowly through the park paths while Keiko followed at a discreet distance to ensure their safety. It was a beautiful autumn day, with leaves turning gold and red overhead and a crisp breeze carrying the scent of approaching winter. They talked about everything and nothing, from childhood memories to favorite foods to dreams they had once held that now seemed impossibly distant. Mrs. Tanaka confessed that she had been considering ending her life before coming to New York. The weight of expectations, the loneliness of her grief, the exhaustion of pretending to be capable when she felt empty inside had all combined to create an unbearable burden. She had thought that if she could just get through this business trip, complete this one last major deal, then perhaps she could find a dignified way to join her husband in whatever came after death. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face Mrs. Tanaka with serious eyes. She acknowledged the courage it took to admit such thoughts and didn't try to dismiss them with hollow reassurances. Instead, she asked Mrs. Tanaka what her husband would want for her, whether he would have wished for her to follow him into death or to find a way to live that honored both their love and her own remaining life. The question hung between them while Mrs. Tanaka struggled with emotions that threatened to overwhelm her again. She admitted that her husband had always been the one who encouraged her to pursue her own interests, who insisted she wasn't just his wife but her own person with value and dreams. He would be heartbroken to know that his death had driven her to such despair, that the empire he built had become a prison rather than a legacy. They sat together on a park bench while Mrs. Tanaka cried quietly, mourning not just her husband but also the life she had abandoned in trying to be what everyone else needed. Sarah didn't offer false comfort or try to rush the grief process. She simply sat with Mrs. Tanaka in that difficult space, demonstrating through her presence that pain could be witnessed and survived, that breaking down wasn't the same as being broken beyond repair. After a while, Mrs. Tanaka began to talk about what she had loved doing before marrying into business empire management. She had been passionate about traditional Japanese pottery, spending hours creating beautiful pieces that combined ancient techniques with modern aesthetics. She had even sold some of her work in small galleries, dreaming of one day opening a studio where she could teach others the art form she loved so deeply. All of that had been set aside as her husband's business grew, and her role as his partner became all-consuming. She told herself she would return to pottery someday, when they retired and had time to pursue personal passions, but that someday had been stolen by death. And now she found herself running a company she never wanted, while the things she loved gathered dust in storage. Sarah asked why Mrs. Tanaka couldn't step down from the company and return to her pottery, why she felt obligated to sacrifice her own well-being for a business that would survive, with or without her. The question seemed so simple yet so revolutionary to Mrs. Tanaka, who had been raised in a culture that prioritized duty and family honor above personal happiness. The idea that she could choose a different path felt both liberating and terrifying. They talked through various possibilities, from appointing a qualified CEO to manage the company, while Mrs. Tanaka served as a board member, to selling the business entirely, and using the proceeds to establish art education programs in her husband's name. Sarah pointed out that truly honoring someone's memory meant living fully, rather than dying slowly under the weight of obligation, that the greatest tribute to love was allowing it to transform you rather than destroy you. As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Tanaka began to look different. The tension in her shoulders eased, and something like hope flickered in her eyes when she talked about possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider. She realized that the business deal in New York wasn't actually about her husband's legacy at all, but about other people's expectations and the momentum of systems that existed independent of any individual's desires. They returned to the plaza as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Mrs. Tanaka thanked Sarah for giving her permission to consider her own needs, for showing her that grief didn't have to be a silent, solitary burden carried until it crushed you completely. Sarah smiled and reminded her that everyone needed someone to witness their pain sometimes, to stand beside them in the darkness and confirm that they weren't crazy or weak for struggling. That evening, Mrs. Tanaka made several phone calls that shocked her assistants and business advisors. She postponed the major deal indefinitely, citing personal circumstances that required her attention. She contacted the board of directors in Tokyo and informed them that she would be stepping down as CEO within 6 months, giving them time to find and transition to new leadership. She scheduled appointments with therapists who specialized in grief counseling, acknowledging that one day with Sarah had opened doors that needed professional support to fully walk through. The assistants were panicking about the business implications and the potential fallout from postponing such a crucial deal. Mrs. Tanaka listened to their concerns with patience but remained firm in her decisions. She explained that she'd been operating on autopilot since her husband's death, making choices based on what others expected rather than what she needed. That pattern had nearly destroyed her completely, and she wasn't willing to sacrifice her life on the altar of business success. Keiko, the younger assistant, surprised everyone by speaking up in support of Mrs. Tanaka's choice. She admitted that she had been terrified watching her employer disappear into that silent place, knowing something was terribly wrong but feeling powerless to help. If stepping back from business meant Mrs. Tanaka could heal and find reasons to live again, then that was infinitely more important than any deal or company. Mrs. Tanaka looked at Keiko with tears in her eyes, realizing that her suffering had affected more people than she knew. She had been so focused on appearing strong and capable that she hadn't noticed the toll her pain was taking on those around her. Sarah had given her more than just a moment of connection in a restaurant. She had offered a model for how to be human and vulnerable, how to acknowledge struggle without shame. Over the next 3 days, Sarah and Mrs. Tanaka formed an unlikely friendship that defied every expectation about how people from such different worlds should interact. They met each morning for breakfast in the penthouse, talking about their lives with an honesty that surprised them both. Mrs. Tanaka shared stories about growing up in post-war Japan and building a life alongside a man whose ambitions matched her own, while Sarah described her childhood in a working-class neighborhood and the struggles of being a young black woman trying to carve out space in environments that often dismissed her presence. What struck Sarah most was how similar their core experiences were despite the vast differences in their circumstances. Both had felt invisible in important ways, with Mrs. Tanaka hidden behind her husband's success, and Sarah overlooked because of assumptions people made about her race and occupation. Both had learned to be strong because vulnerability felt dangerous, and both had discovered that suppressing pain only made it more powerful in the end. Mrs. Tanaka wanted to do something meaningful with the revelation Sarah had given her, and she began to form an idea that excited her more than anything had in months. She asked Sarah about her dreams of becoming a therapist, about the graduate school plans she had been saving for while working at the restaurant. Sarah explained that she was still about 2 years away from having enough money for tuition and living expenses, and even then she would likely need to work part-time throughout her studies to make ends meet. The next morning, Mrs. Tanaka presented Sarah with an offer that left her speechless. She wanted to fund Sarah's entire graduate education, including tuition, living expenses, and a stipend that would allow her to focus completely on her studies without worrying about money. But there was more to the proposal than simple generosity. Mrs. Tanaka explained that she wanted Sarah to specialize in grief counseling and cultural competency, to become the kind of therapist who could bridge gaps between different communities and help people from various backgrounds navigate loss and trauma. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse such an extravagant gift, feeling uncomfortable with the idea of accepting so much from someone she had only just met. But Mrs. Tanaka gently insisted that this wasn't charity, but rather an investment in something meaningful. She explained that Sarah had given her back her life with one whispered word and a willingness to see her suffering, and that gift was beyond any monetary value. By funding Sarah's education, Mrs. Tanaka could ensure that many more people would benefit from the compassion and insight that had saved her from drowning in silence. They discussed the arrangement in detail, with Mrs. Tanaka's lawyers drawing up papers that would establish an educational trust fund in Sarah's name. There were no strings attached, no expectations beyond Sarah pursuing her dream of helping others navigate difficult emotional terrain. Mrs. Tanaka also revealed plans to establish a foundation focused on mental health support for people dealing with grief, particularly in communities where cultural expectations made it difficult to acknowledge emotional struggle openly. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of her circumstances. Just days ago, she had been a waitress serving expensive meals to people who rarely noticed her existence, and now she was being offered opportunities that seemed impossible. She worried about whether she deserved such generosity, whether she was qualified to accept this kind of support, whether the whole situation was too good to be true. Mrs. Tanaka recognized Sarah's internal struggle and addressed it directly. She explained that worthiness wasn't something you earned through suffering or proved through self-sacrifice. Sometimes grace arrived unearned and unexpected, and the appropriate response was gratitude rather than guilt. Sarah had shown up in the right place at the right time with the exact gift that was needed, and that synchronicity deserved to be honored rather than questioned. On Sarah's last day before Mrs. Tanaka returned to Japan, they visited a small pottery studio in Brooklyn that Mrs. Tanaka had discovered online. The owner was a Japanese artist who had emigrated to America decades ago, and her work combined traditional techniques with contemporary designs in ways that made Mrs. Tanaka's eyes light up with recognition and longing. They spent hours talking with the artist about the meditative nature of working with clay, about how the process of creating something beautiful from shapeless material could be deeply healing. Mrs. Tanaka arranged to take several private lessons with the artist during her extended stay in New York. She had decided not to rush back to Tokyo, but instead to take time for herself, to begin rebuilding a life that included things she loved rather than only obligations she dreaded. The board of directors was managing the company in her absence, and the world had not ended despite the postponed business deal. In fact, reports indicated that her decision to step back had been received with surprising understanding by most parties involved. Sarah watched Mrs. Tanaka handle the soft clay with careful attention, her face showing concentration and peace rather than the haunted emptiness that had marked their first meeting. There was still grief there. Still sadness in her eyes when she talked about her husband, but it was grief that moved rather than paralyzed, that honored love rather than destroyed life. The transformation wasn't complete, and Sarah knew that healing would be a long process with setbacks and difficult days ahead. But the direction had changed fundamentally. They talked about staying in touch, with Mrs. Tanaka insisting that Sarah send regular updates about her progress in graduate school. She wanted to hear about the theories Sarah learned and the clients she would eventually help, to know that their brief connection had rippled outward into the world in meaningful ways. Sarah promised to write often and to visit Japan someday when her studies allowed, eager to see the pottery studio Mrs. Tanaka dreamed of creating. On their final evening together, they returned to the Grand Sterling restaurant where everything had begun. Marcus greeted them warmly, and Mr. Pemberton himself came out to welcome them and apologize again for his initial reaction to their first meeting. The restaurant had been transformed by that encounter as well, with staff members now receiving training on recognizing signs of mental health crisis and responding with compassion rather than simply removing uncomfortable situations. They sat at a quiet table near the window, watching the city lights sparkle in the darkness beyond the glass. The meal was delicious, but neither of them paid much attention to the expensive food. Instead, they talked about hope and second chances, about the mysterious ways that lives could intersect and change direction in a single moment. Mrs. Tanaka admitted that she had come to New York prepared to die and was leaving determined to live, and that transformation was worth more than all the money in the world. Sarah reflected on how close she had come to not intervening that first night, how easy it would have been to stay in her assigned role and let management handle the situation. She had taken a risk by stepping forward, motivated by empathy rather than any expectation of reward, and that choice had altered the trajectory of her entire life. It made her think about all the other moments when people might choose connection over safety, vulnerability over protection, and how the world might be different if more people made that choice. As they said goodbye outside the restaurant, Mrs. Tanaka hugged Sarah with genuine affection, thanking her again for the gift of seeing her when she had become invisible even to herself. Sarah returned the embrace, grateful for the reminder that her capacity to help others wasn't dependent on degrees or credentials, but on willingness to witness suffering and respond with authentic humanity. They promised to meet again, knowing that their friendship had been forged in crisis but would endure through the calmer waters ahead. The car arrived to take Mrs. Tanaka back to the plaza, and Sarah watched it disappear into the Manhattan traffic before turning to walk toward the subway station. She pulled out her phone and began researching graduate programs in counseling psychology, feeling excited about the future in ways she hadn't allowed herself to imagine before. The path ahead was still uncertain and would require hard work and dedication, but it was her path now, chosen rather than defaulted into, supported rather than struggled for alone. Back at her apartment that night, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table and wrote in her journal about the past few days. She described the moment of decision in the restaurant, the hours of conversation with Mrs. Tanaka, and the overwhelming generosity that had transformed her circumstances so completely. But what she kept returning to was the single word she had whispered that started everything: breathe. Such a simple instruction, yet so powerful when offered to someone drowning in pain they couldn't express. Sarah realized that much of what people needed in their darkest moments wasn't complex therapy or profound wisdom, but rather basic reminders of how to exist when existence itself felt impossible. Breathe, keep going. You're not alone. Sometimes the smallest gestures created space for the largest transformations. 2 years later, Sarah walked across the stage to receive her master's degree in counseling psychology, her cap and gown billowing slightly in the spring breeze. The outdoor ceremony was held on the university lawn, with hundreds of graduates celebrating their achievements alongside proud families and friends. Sarah's younger brother and aunt cheered loudly from the audience, holding up signs with her name written in colorful letters. But there was another face in the crowd that made Sarah's heart swell with gratitude and joy. Mrs. Tanaka had flown from Tokyo specifically to attend the graduation, bringing with her keiko and several beautifully wrapped gifts. She sat in the guest section wearing an elegant dress and a smile that reached her eyes in ways it hadn't during those dark days in New York. The two women had stayed in close contact throughout Sarah's graduate studies, exchanging long emails and video calls that chronicled their parallel journeys of healing and growth. After the ceremony, they embraced like family members reunited after too long apart. Mrs. Tanaka presented Sarah with a piece of pottery she had created herself, a delicate bowl with blue glaze that seemed to capture both sadness and hope in its flowing patterns. She explained that making it had been part of her own therapy, a way of transforming pain into something beautiful that could hold and contain rather than destroy. Sarah cradled the bowl carefully, understanding the symbolic weight of the gift and the journey it represented. They walked together through the campus grounds while Sarah shared stories about her most challenging classes and the clients she had worked with during her practicum placements. She described helping a teenage girl process her father's suicide, supporting an elderly man through the loss of his wife after 60 years of marriage, and facilitating a grief support group for parents who had lost children. Each experience had deepened her understanding of how people carry loss and how healing happens in unique ways for every individual. Mrs. Tanaka listened with visible pride, recognizing echoes of their own story in Sarah's descriptions of her work. She shared her own updates about the pottery studio she had opened in Kyoto, a bright space where she taught traditional techniques to students of all ages while also creating her own pieces for exhibition. The studio had become more than just a business. It was a community hub where people came not just to learn pottery, but to find connection and peace in the meditative practice of working with clay. The foundation Mrs. Tanaka had established was also thriving, providing mental health resources and grief counseling to communities throughout Japan, where such support had been scarce or stigmatized. She had hired a team of culturally competent therapists and had developed programs specifically designed to help people navigate loss while honoring cultural values around privacy and strength. The foundation had already helped thousands of people, and Mrs. Tanaka credited Sarah with inspiring the entire initiative. Sarah felt humbled by the ripple effects of that single moment in the restaurant 2 years ago. She had simply done what felt right in responding to another person's suffering, with no expectation of reward or recognition. Yet, that choice had not only transformed her own life, but had created pathways for countless others to receive support during their darkest times. It made her think about the power of small acts of courage and how one person's willingness to show up could change entire systems. They found a quiet bench near a flowering tree and sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching students and families celebrate across the lawn. Mrs. Tanaka eventually spoke about how different she felt compared to the woman who had arrived in New York 2 years ago, barely holding herself together and contemplating ending her life. The grief over her husband's death was still present and probably always would be, but it had transformed from something that destroyed her into something that connected her more deeply to her own humanity and to others experiencing similar pain. Sarah acknowledged that grief never truly ended but rather changed shape over time, becoming something you carried differently rather than something that carried you. She had seen this pattern repeatedly in her clinical work and in her own experience with her mother's death. The acute agony eventually gave way to a persistent ache, and then to a tender spot that could still hurt when pressed but didn't dominate every moment. Learning to live with loss rather than trying to overcome it was perhaps the most important lesson she had absorbed during her training. Mrs. Tanaka revealed that she had started dating someone, a widower she had met through her pottery studio, who understood the particular loneliness of losing a life partner. It felt strange and slightly guilty at first, as if moving toward new love somehow betrayed the old. But her therapist had helped her understand that the heart's capacity wasn't limited or finite. She could honor her late husband's memory while also opening herself to new possibilities, and in fact, living fully was the greatest tribute she could offer to their years together. Sarah celebrated this news with genuine happiness, recognizing the courage it took for Mrs. Tanaka to risk vulnerability again after such devastating loss. They talked about the fear of loving when you know how much it hurts to lose, and how that fear could either close you off from life or deepen your appreciation for every moment of connection. Mrs. Tanaka had chosen the latter path, and Sarah could see how that choice had made her more vibrant and present than any amount of forced strength could have achieved. The conversation turned to Sarah's plans for the future. She had accepted a position at a community mental health center that specialized in serving diverse populations, including many immigrants and refugees dealing with complicated grief and trauma. The pay wasn't spectacular, but the work aligned perfectly with her values and training. She was also developing a private practice focused specifically on grief counseling, using techniques she had learned and refined to help people navigate loss in ways that honored both their pain and their resilience. Mrs. Tanaka insisted on providing seed funding for Sarah's private practice, wanting to ensure she had the resources to create a welcoming space and keep fees affordable for clients who might not have insurance coverage. Sarah had learned to accept Mrs. Tanaka's generosity with gratitude rather than resistance, understanding that giving brought the older woman as much joy as receiving brought Sarah opportunity. Their relationship had evolved beyond benefactor and recipient into something more like family, built on mutual respect and genuine care. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, touring the campus and talking about everything from pottery techniques to therapy, theories to plans for future visits. Mrs. Tanaka extended an open invitation for Sarah to come to Japan and teach workshops at her studio, combining grief counseling with artistic expression in ways that might help people access and process emotions they couldn't put into words. Sarah accepted enthusiastically, already imagining the possibilities of such integration. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the university grounds, they walked back toward the parking area where Mrs. Tanaka's rental car waited. They hugged again, holding on longer this time, both aware of how precious their connection was and how easily they might never have met at all. Mrs. Tanaka reminded Sarah to keep breathing, to stay grounded in her body even when the work got difficult, and Sarah laughed at hearing her own advice reflected back to her. The drive back to the city gave Sarah time to reflect on the strange and beautiful trajectory her life had taken. She thought about the version of herself who had been serving tables at the Grand Sterling restaurant, saving money slowly, and wondering if she would ever achieve her dreams. That Sarah could never have imagined the opportunities that would flow from one moment of choosing compassion over caution, connection over protocol. She had stepped forward when it would have been easier to step back, and that choice had opened doors she didn't even know existed. But what moved Sarah most wasn't the material benefits or even the educational opportunities, significant as those were. It was the profound reminder that every person carried invisible struggles, that suffering didn't respect boundaries of wealth or status or culture. and that sometimes the greatest healing came from simply being witnessed by another human who understood. She had given Mrs. Tanaka the gift of being seen in her darkest moment, and Mrs. Tanaka had given Sarah the gift of resources and support to extend that seeing to many others. Sarah began her work at the Community Mental Health Center the following week, nervous but ready to serve the diverse population who came through its doors. She thought about Mrs. Tanaka often during those first months, drawing on their story as inspiration when the work felt overwhelming or when clients seemed unreachable. She would remember that single word whispered in a restaurant and the avalanche of change it had triggered, and she would approach each new client with patience and faith. That connection was possible even in the darkest silences. One evening, Sarah received a package from Japan containing a letter and a photograph. The letter was from Mrs. Tanaka, describing a new program at her foundation that trained healthcare workers and family members to recognize and respond to severe grief reactions. The photograph showed a large group of people gathered at the pottery studio, holding certificates of completion from the training. Mrs. Tanaka explained that each person trained would go on to help countless others, creating expanding circles of compassion and understanding that all traced back to that moment in New York, when a young black waitress had refused to look away from suffering. Sarah placed the photograph on her office wall, where she could see it every day as she met with clients navigating their own journeys through loss and pain. It reminded her that transformation was always possible, that human connection had power beyond what could be measured or predicted, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was whisper a simple reminder to breathe and be present with whatever came next. The bowl Mrs. Tanaka had made sat on Sarah's desk, holding pens and small items but representing so much more. Every time Sarah looked at it, she saw proof that brokenness could be transformed into beauty, that pain could be shaped into something that served others, and that the deepest wounds could become sources of the greatest wisdom. She had learned this truth in watching her mother die, had recognized it in Mrs. Tanaka's desperate silence, and was now witnessing it again and again in the clients who trusted her with their most vulnerable moments. Years would pass, and both women would continue their parallel journeys of helping others navigate grief and rediscover reasons to live. They would visit each other regularly, maintaining their unlikely friendship across continents and cultures. They would collaborate on projects that brought together Eastern and Western approaches to healing, that honored both individual pain and communal support, that recognized grief as a universal human experience transcending all boundaries. But they would always return to that first night in the Grand Sterling restaurant, to the moment when everything changed because one person chose to see another person's suffering and respond with compassion. That moment had taught them both that healing often begins with the smallest gestures, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer another human being is simply your presence and a gentle reminder that they are not alone.